We live in an age where the term self-love is repeated like a universal mantra. We're told to set boundaries, to prioritize our desires, to never settle for less than what we deserve. At first, this movement seemed necessary. After generations in which, especially women, were taught to erase themselves in the name of love, the call for self-care and self-worth became a banner of liberation. But as happens with so many valuable ideas, something twisted along the way. Self-love, instead of becoming a path to emotional maturity, often turned into a glittering mask that hides a darker core. Narcissism. Carl Jung warned us that every luminous archetype has its shadow, and the shadow of self-love is selfishness disguised as virtue. Today, countless messages proclaim, "I love myself too much to explain myself. If you don't worship me, I don't need you. I am my absolute priority." On the surface, these phrases sound like empowerment. In practice, they often become walls that block real intimacy. Because to love oneself should not mean dehumanizing the other or closing off all possibilities of connection. The mirage works like this. We believe we are cultivating self-love, but in reality, we are reinforcing a shield to protect ourselves from past wounds. We say no one deserves us, when deep down, what we feel is fear that someone might reject us if they saw our vulnerabilities. In this way, the concept becomes corrupted and turns into a sophisticated justification for emotional isolation. And what's most dangerous, the one who lives under this mirage believes they are standing at the peak of personal evolution, when in fact they are still bound by the same chains of insecurity, only now decorated with modern language. True self-love does not need to shout its existence nor armor itself with arrogance. It arises from accepting both our light and shadow, from the capacity to acknowledge mistakes, from loving without losing dignity, yet also without fearing the risk of opening up. When we confuse that path with the glorification of the ego above all, the mirage breaks, and what remains is loneliness. Jung would say that in those cases, we are not practicing self-love, but worshiping the ego as an idol. And no idol can sustain us in intimacy. Sooner or later, the mirage fades and reveals the emptiness we were trying to hide. Carl Jung understood the human psyche as a vast landscape shaped not only by conscious thoughts, but also by powerful unconscious forces. One of the most dangerous illusions, according to his framework, is when people believe they are acting out of strength and self-knowledge, while in reality they are being driven by hidden wounds and shadow impulses. This is precisely what happens when narcissism disguises itself as self-love. To Jung, narcissism was not just vanity or arrogance. It was a symptom of psychic imbalance, a refusal to integrate the shadow, the denied and repressed parts of ourselves. When we fail to acknowledge our shadow, it does not disappear. It takes control of our behavior from behind the scenes. In modern dating, this manifests as people loudly declaring independence, superiority, or emotional detachment, while unconsciously battling deep fears of rejection, abandonment, and unworthiness. They call it self-love, but Jung would recognize it as a defensive strategy of the ego, a desperate attempt to protect the fragile self-image from collapse. Unconscious narcissism operates like a mirror that reflects only what we want to see. For example, someone might say, "I don't settle because I know my worth," when the truth is they are terrified of intimacy and use idealized standards to keep others at a distance. Another person may insist, "I need no one, I am whole on my own," while beneath the surface they are haunted by unresolved childhood wounds of neglect or betrayal. The tragedy is that the individual cannot see the real motivation. They honestly believe they are practicing empowerment, when, in fact, they are simply hiding behind a carefully constructed persona. Jung would describe this as the domination of the ego at the expense of the self, the deeper center of the psyche that seeks wholeness. When the ego inflates under the banner of self-love, it cuts off the possibility of authentic relationships, because every partner becomes either an admirer to feed the ego or a threat to expose its fragility. This explains why so many modern relationships collapse under the weight of projection, ghosting, or sudden withdrawal. What appears to be strength is actually fear wearing the mask of confidence. The key insight Jung offers is that true healing requires us to confront the unconscious narcissism within. Only by acknowledging the shadow, our neediness, our fears, our vulnerability, can we begin to experience genuine self-love. Without that integration, self-love remains a hollow performance, leaving us isolated and disconnected even in the midst of countless romantic encounters. In today's dating culture, independence is praised almost like a sacred virtue. We are told that the healthiest relationships come from two individuals who need no one, who stand entirely on their own, and who only choose each other from a place of abundance. On the surface, this idea feels empowering. Why shouldn't we value self-sufficiency and resilience? But, as Carl Jung would remind us, every archetype carries its shadow. The extreme glorification of independence often hides a profound fear of vulnerability and intimacy, becoming yet another form of narcissism disguised as self-love. This cult of independence is most visible in the language of modern dating. Phrases like, "I don't catch feelings," "I'm better off alone," or "I won't let anyone have power over me" are spoken as if they were badges of honor. Beneath them, however, lies a deeper story. The individual has likely been hurt, abandoned, or betrayed in the past, and instead of healing, they build an identity around invulnerability. Independence becomes not a healthy boundary, but a fortress that no one is allowed to penetrate. Jung would see this as the ego's strategy to protect itself from the unbearable pain of rejection. By convincing ourselves that we don't need anyone, we avoid the risk of being wounded again. But the price of this illusion is steep. We may feel powerful in the short term, but over time, relationships become transactional, superficial, or endlessly temporary. Intimacy, the very thing we secretly long for, becomes impossible, because genuine intimacy requires dependence, trust, and the courage to say, "I need you." This extreme independence also reveals the shadow of our cultural moment, a fear of losing control. Modern dating apps, hookup culture, and the constant availability of new options create the illusion that connection can be managed without risk. But Jungian psychology teaches that love is inherently transformative. It demands that we surrender parts of the ego and open ourselves to change. The cult of independence resists this process. It clings to control, denying the vulnerability that makes love real. What results is a paradox. People who appear the most confident and untouchable are often those carrying the deepest hidden wounds. Their independence, celebrated as strength, is in fact a wall built out of fear, and while the world applauds them for being self-sufficient, their souls remain starved of the intimacy they secretly crave. Jung would argue that until we confront this shadow, until we admit that extreme independence is often just disguised fear, we will remain prisoners of our own defenses, unable to experience the wholeness that true love requires. Few phrases capture the spirit of modern dating as powerfully as "I love myself too much to settle." On the surface, it sounds like wisdom. Why should anyone accept less than they deserve? Why should we tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, or half-hearted affection? In its healthiest form, this mindset can protect us from toxic dynamics. But Carl Jung would warn us, whenever a phrase becomes an absolute, it risks slipping into the territory of shadow. And in this case, what looks like self-love can, in truth, be the ego's most sophisticated disguise for fear. When someone says, "I won't settle," they may believe they are standing firmly in self-worth. Yet often, beneath that declaration lies a wound that whispers, "If I allow myself to be vulnerable, I might be rejected, abandoned, or exposed. Instead of confronting that fear, the ego reframes it as strength. It turns defensiveness into empowerment, rejection into choice. In Jungian terms, this is the shadow at work, what we cannot accept in ourselves. Our fear of inadequacy, our need for love, emerges in distorted, unconscious forms. This mindset also creates an impossible standard in relationships. Perfection becomes the price of entry. No partner can make mistakes, show weakness, or reveal their own shadow without risking being labeled not enough. The phrase, "I love myself too much to settle," then acts as a shield, protecting the speaker from disappointment, but simultaneously ensuring they never experience true intimacy. After all, intimacy is not built on perfection. It's built on the messy, vulnerable, and sometimes painful reality of two imperfect people choosing each other. Jung believed that the ego's main trap is inflation, the illusion that the self is above the ordinary struggles of life. In modern dating, the no settling mantra often reflects this inflation. It suggests that one's worth is so elevated that no human connection could possibly measure up. But beneath the surface, this is not strength, it's fragility. It's the inability to risk being seen as we truly are, flaws and all. The tragedy is that the person who repeats this mantra most fiercely often desires connection the most deeply. But because they cannot reconcile their longing with their fear, they live suspended in a paradox, untouchable yet lonely, empowered yet unfulfilled. Jung would argue that the only way out is integration, acknowledging the fear beneath the mantra, and allowing the possibility of imperfection in love. Only then does self-love stop being a rejection of others and start becoming a foundation for real human connection. We live in an era where connection has never been easier. With a swipe, a message, or a like, we can instantly reach thousands of people across the world. Modern dating apps promise endless possibilities, while social media allows us to curate and broadcast our identities to an audience larger than entire civilizations of the past. And yet, despite this apparent abundance of connection, loneliness has never been more pervasive. Carl Jung would recognize this as a paradox of the modern psyche. The more we chase validation through digital means, the further we drift from true intimacy. On the surface, technology seems to empower self-love. Posting affirmations, selfies, or lifestyle highlights can feel like acts of self-acceptance. We proclaim independence, celebrate our standards, and receive applause in the form of likes and comments. But beneath the glittering facade, Jung would see the shadow at play. Because what appears as empowerment is often dependency, on algorithms, on external validation, on the approval of strangers. The ego thrives in this digital marketplace, inflating itself with attention, while the deeper self, the authentic core that longs for real connection, remains starved. In dating, this paradox becomes even sharper. Apps encourage us to view people as profiles, as curated images and witty captions, rather than as whole, flawed human beings. The illusion of infinite choice trains us to treat intimacy as disposable. Why invest in vulnerability when another option is just a swipe away? In this environment, self-love is often invoked as a justification for detachment. I don't need to reply, I'm protecting my peace. If they don't match my vibe instantly, I move on. What sounds like confidence may simply be avoidance. Jung would argue that this is the collective shadow of our technological age. We mistake stimulation for connection, performance for authenticity, validation for love. We call it self-love, but in reality, it is the ego's addiction to being seen, without ever risking the pain of being truly known. The tragedy of the digital paradox is that it feeds the very loneliness it claims to solve. The more we perform self-love online, the less capacity we have for the raw, unfiltered vulnerability of face-to-face connection. The ego shines, but the soul withers. Jung's wisdom reminds us that true connection requires depth, imperfection, and presence, things no algorithm can replicate. Until we see through this paradox, modern dating will remain a cycle of endless contact and profound disconnection. Carl Jung believed that every relationship acts as a mirror. We are drawn to others not randomly, but because they reflect back parts of our own psyche, both the qualities we consciously value and the traits we have repressed into the shadow. In the context of modern dating, this insight is crucial. When self-love turns into narcissism, relationships no longer serve as opportunities for growth and integration. Instead, they become stages where the ego seeks applause and control, refusing to acknowledge the uncomfortable truths the mirror reveals. Think of the partner who irritates us with their neediness, their jealousy, or their emotional demands. Jung would suggest that what bothers us most in others often reflects something unresolved within ourselves. Perhaps we too are secretly dependent or insecure, but we cannot accept it, so we reject those traits in the other. In this way, the relationship becomes a mirror of the fragmented self. But when narcissism disguises itself as self-love, the mirror is ignored. The ego insists, the problem is with them, not me. This refusal to see the mirror explains why so many modern relationships collapse quickly. Ghosting, for example, is not just avoidance. It is the ego's refusal to face the shadow that another person has triggered. Instead of asking, why does this person's behavior touch something painful in me? The narcissistic posture says, I don't need this, I deserve better, and disappears. What looks like self-respect is often the inability to confront the fractured parts of our own soul. The danger is that the more we run from these mirrors, the more fragmented we become. Each relationship abandoned prematurely leaves us with an even greater illusion of superiority and an even deeper loneliness. Jung would argue that true self-love is not about escaping mirrors but about using them. When someone triggers our wounds, that is not necessarily a sign that they are wrong for us. It may be the psyche's invitation to heal. Modern dating, however, has commodified relationships to such an extent that mirrors are discarded like defective products. Instead of asking what the reflection reveals, we simply swipe to the next. The narcissistic ego thrives in this cycle, endlessly avoiding discomfort, but the self, the deeper, wiser center within us, remains undeveloped. Jung's insight is clear. Until we dare to look into the mirror of relationship and embrace the fragmented pieces we see, intimacy will remain impossible. At its core, self-love is meant to be an act of compassion, an honest acceptance of who we are, including our flaws, vulnerabilities, and contradictions. But in the modern dating landscape, this noble idea is often hijacked and twisted into something Jung would describe as ego inflation. Instead of nurturing the self, many fall into worshiping the ego. Self-love becomes self-idolatry. The difference is subtle but profound. Genuine self-love does not demand perfection. It acknowledges weakness without shame. Self-idolatry, on the other hand, places the self on a pedestal, demanding constant admiration and refusing to admit fault. We see this in the endless affirmations of superiority. I am the prize. Anyone would be lucky to have me. If they can't handle me at my best, they don't deserve me at all. What looks like confidence is often the ego's attempt to drown out insecurity by constructing an image of invulnerability. Jung would argue that this shift from love to idolatry occurs when the individual identifies entirely with the ego, mistaking it for the whole of the self. In this state, relationships are no longer about mutual growth or discovery. They become stages for the performance of one's greatness. Partners are not seen as equals, but as worshippers, or as threats to be discarded if they fail to maintain the illusion. This is why so many modern relationships collapse under the weight of constant power struggles. Love has been replaced by a battle for validation. Self-idolatry also carries a hidden cost. The more the ego inflates, the more fragile it becomes. Any criticism, rejection, or even mild indifference can feel like an attack on the entire identity. In dating, this leads to volatility. Intense passion at first, followed by explosive conflict or sudden withdrawal when the partner inevitably fails to uphold the idol's image. The tragedy is that the person most devoted to their own self-idol is often the most dependent on others to confirm it. True self-love in Jung's sense is quieter and humbler. It does not deny the shadow but integrates it, allowing space for imperfection in oneself and in others. Self-idolatry, by contrast, denies the shadow completely and projects it outward, condemning others for what it refuses to face within. Until this distinction is recognized, modern dating will continue to breed isolation disguised as empowerment. Because worshiping the self may bring fleeting validation, but it can never offer the depth of intimacy that only genuine love toward self and others can sustain. When narcissism hides beneath the mask of self-love, its consequences ripple through every layer of modern dating. On the surface, it creates a culture that glorifies confidence, independence, and high standards. But underneath, it leaves behind a trail of disconnection, disappointment, and emotional burnout. Carl Jung would describe this as the shadow of an age. What we celebrate outwardly is often the very thing that corrodes us from within. One of the clearest impacts is the rise of superficial bonds. Dating apps, social media, and hookup culture thrive on quick impressions and instant gratification. In this environment, self-love is frequently invoked as a reason to avoid effort. I won't chase anyone. If it doesn't feel perfect right away, I'm out. These statements, cloaked in empowerment, are often nothing more than the ego's refusal to face discomfort. The result is a revolving door of short-lived encounters that promise excitement, but rarely lead to depth. Another impact is the normalization of ghosting and avoidance. When someone triggers insecurity or fails to meet an impossible ideal, the narcissistic posture simply erases them. Instead of grappling with conflict, vulnerability, or growth, the ego cuts ties under the banner of protecting peace. Jung would call this the refusal to engage with the shadow, avoiding the very experiences that could lead to integration and transformation. Modern dating, in this sense, becomes less about relationships and more about self-preservation through avoidance. Perhaps most damaging of all is the erosion of trust. In a culture where everyone is performing self-love, suspicion runs high. Are they really interested in me, or are they just using me to validate themselves? This mutual doubt breeds anxiety and keeps intimacy at arm's length. When every connection feels like a transaction, love loses its sacred quality and becomes a marketplace exchange. Jung warned that when the ego dominates, the soul suffers. We see this suffering today in rising loneliness, anxiety, and the widespread sense that dating feels more exhausting than fulfilling. The devastation is not just personal, but collective. Entire generations are learning to equate self-protection with empowerment, mistaking avoidance for strength and idolizing independence over vulnerability. What gets lost in the process is the very thing we long for: the healing power of authentic love. Jung's insight is sharp. Here, until we learn to see through the disguise of narcissism, modern dating will continue to fracture, leaving behind individuals who are outwardly strong but inwardly aching with isolation. The most dangerous consequence of narcissism disguised as self-love is not what happens between people, but what happens within. Behind the polished affirmations, the curated independence, and the loud declarations of empowerment, there is often a silence no one wants to confront: emptiness. Carl Jung would describe this emptiness as the inevitable outcome of refusing to integrate the shadow. When the ego inflates itself under the guise of self-love, it disconnects from the deeper self, the source of wholeness, meaning, and authentic love. On the outside, the individual may look radiant, confident, untouchable, self-sufficient. But internally, the story is very different. There is a constant hunger for validation, for attention, for signs that the identity they have crafted is enough. This hunger can never be satisfied because it does not come from the self, but from the ego's fragility. No matter how many likes, dates, or admirers arrive, the emptiness always returns once the spotlight fades. Jung would call this the neurosis of modern love, endless chasing without ever arriving at fulfillment. This emptiness also breeds disconnection. When we cannot tolerate our own vulnerability, we begin to fear it in others. Intimacy feels threatening because it exposes the cracks in the ego's mask. As a result, relationships remain shallow or transactional, reinforcing the cycle of loneliness. The person tells themselves, "I'm better off alone," but the solitude does not heal them. It deepens their sense of isolation. What masqueraded as self-love becomes, in reality, self-abandonment. The invisible cost is psychological exhaustion, constantly performing strength, constantly rejecting anything that threatens the illusion, drains the soul. Jung warned that denying the shadow doesn't destroy it. It forces it underground, where it grows darker and more destructive. For many in modern dating, this shadow emerges as anxiety, depression, or a gnawing sense that something is missing, even when life looks successful from the outside. The tragedy is that the very thing people are running from, the risk of vulnerability, the fear of rejection, is also the path to healing. Without facing the shadow, without admitting our need for love, we remain split within ourselves. Jung's wisdom reminds us that true self-love is integration, holding our strength and fragility together, allowing intimacy to mirror both without shame. Until then, the cost of narcissism disguised as self-love will remain invisible but devastating. A world full of people connected to everyone, yet profoundly disconnected from themselves. If narcissism disguised as self-love creates emptiness, then the path forward must be a return to authenticity. Carl Jung believed that real healing comes through integration, embracing both the light and the shadow within us. Authentic self-love is not about inflating the ego or building walls of superiority. It is about wholeness. It is the courage to face our vulnerabilities, to acknowledge our wounds, and to accept ourselves without distortion. True self-love does not say, "I don't need anyone." It says, "I am enough as I am, and from that place I can love and be loved." It does not demand perfection from partners but recognizes that intimacy requires patience, forgiveness, and the willingness to walk through discomfort together. Jung would argue that this kind of self-love is rooted not in the ego, but in the self, the deeper center of the psyche that connects us to meaning, purpose, and relationship. The return to authentic self-love begins with humility. Instead of declaring ourselves untouchable, we learn to admit our fears: fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough. By bringing these fears into consciousness, we strip them of their power. Jung taught that what we refuse to face in ourselves becomes our fate. What we confront becomes our transformation. In dating, this means recognizing that our partners are not here to worship us or complete us, but to mirror us, and through that mirror, to help us grow. Authentic self-love is also relational. It understands that love is not diminished by needing others but deepened by it. To say, "I need you," is not weakness. It is human truth. The narcissistic ego rejects this dependence, but the integrated self embraces it as part of the wholeness of life. Vulnerability becomes not a threat, but a bridge. In the end, the task Jung leaves us with is not to abandon self-love, but to reclaim it from distortion. Self-love must return to its essence: compassion, acceptance, integration. When we stop worshiping the ego and begin nurturing the self, we discover a love that is quiet, steady, and unshakable. And from that foundation, we can finally approach modern dating not as a marketplace of validation, but as a sacred arena where two imperfect souls can meet in truth. This is the antidote to the devastation of narcissism in disguise. To remember that love, of self and others, was never meant to be a performance. It was meant to be real.